Gittin Daf Mem Gimel Amud Bet and Mem Daled Amud Aleph. Responsibility is a privilege. Tfisa b'safeka b'machar avdo la'akum. We're dealing with an amazing piece of Gemara that's going to teach us that responsibility is not a burden. Responsibility is an enormous privilege, and it impacts the stature of the person who carries it. It's not just a job, it's not just a duty. It actually affects the stature of the individual. The sugi is based on the Mishnah on Daf Mem Gimel Amud Bet. HaMocher avdo lovdei chavim o lechutz la'aretz yatzeh ben chorin. There's a knas of the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon institute a fine, so to say, on an individual who sells his Eved Knani to a non-Jew or to somebody who takes him to Chutz La'aretz. Why? Explains Rashi, in this case, that Konsino Toliftoto, the knas is, Ho'il v'hifki'o min mitzvot, because he has removed him from a body of mitzvahs. The Eved Knani is chayev with the mitzvot that a woman is obligated, so he has a body of halachot attached to him. And when he goes and he's now working for a non-Jew, the non-Jew is not going to facilitate him keeping these mitzvot, and so he's out of the realm of these halachot. V'chein lechutz lecherut mipnei shehotzio me'eretz lechutz la'aretz. Because here also he takes him to Chutz La'aretz, and there are certain halachot that apply in Eretz Yisrael which don't apply in Chutz La'aretz. So you're removing the person, and we learned this in Masechta Nazir, that when a person takes on an additional body of halachot, that adds to his kedusha. There's a correlation between the halachot that govern a person or an individual or a situation, and the kedusha. Shabbos has more kedusha than the days of the week, because there are more halachot attached to it. And Nazir has more kedusha than an ordinary person, a Kohen more than a Yisrael, a Jew more than a non-Jew. Whenever there's a body of halachot, there is an increase in kedusha. And here we begin to see this impact of responsibility, that when I'm responsible for a body of halachas, with that comes a different being. It's not the same human being, a Kohen and a Yisrael and an Akum, a Ben Eretz Yisrael and a Ben Chutz La'aretz. When we're in Eretz Yisrael, there's a body of halachot that apply to us, that don't apply to us in Chutz La'aretz. All of these change the stature and the status of the individual concerned because of the additional body of halachot that govern him. And by sending this Eved Knani into non-Jewish ownership or into Chutz La'aretz, we're reducing the number of halachot, the body of halachot that apply to him, and therefore we're reducing the kedusha. Boy Rabbi Yirmi asked on Daf Mem Daled, a whole lot of questions. What happens if you sell him for only 30 days? If you sell him and you say, but he's not for work, you can't work him on Shabbos or anything, I'm just selling him to you you can breed slaves with him, but I'm not selling him for work. All of these cases where you're not really sending him into a permanent situation of fewer mitzvot, does this knas still apply? And the Gemara leaves it as a question. The Rambam quotes all of these cases in the Gemara and asks, what happens Im tafas ha'eved kedei damav l'rabo. If the Eved was tofes, he grabbed the amount of money needed to buy his freedom. So there's a knas. The Rebbe, the owner, is supposed to redeem him. Let's say it costs him $100,000 to redeem him, and he didn't redeem him, he wasn't redeeming him. And in these cases here, where there's a sofek, because the Gemara doesn't resolve the cases. So in these cases where he's giving restricted sale to the non-Jew or to Chutz La'aretz, so now we're in a sofek, the Gemara hasn't clarified. Does the knas still apply? Is he still obligated to redeem the slave or not? And once he's redeemed the slave goes free. So he loses on both sides. He has to pay the non-Jew to buy the slave back, and then he's got to let the slave free. Does that apply in these cases that the Gemara quotes of restricted sales? The Gemara doesn't clarify. Says the Rambam, since it's a case of sofek, if he grabbed the amount of money that the owner should be paying, he grabbed that 100,000 to buy his own freedom. He doesn't have to repay that, because really the owner was supposed to do it. Or at least there was a sofek, and the din is that if there is a sofek, there's a doubt whether or not a person is entitled to a certain amount of money from another individual, and so Beis Din can't enforce it because we're not sure. But the individual grabs the money. We don't make him repay the money that he's grabbed. We leave the money wherever it is. If the first person hasn't paid what he might have to pay, we don't force him to pay. If the second person grabbed what he believes he was entitled to be paid, we don't take it back from him. We just leave the status quo as it is. Says the Ravid, Mecharo lakum l'shloshim yom v'chulu adein motzim miyodo. Omer Avrom, the Ravid says, Ein biknasot tfisa mo'elet ela lemi shechesaro mamon. A very important comment that the Ravid makes. Why are we talking about tfisa here? There has been no monetary damage to the slave. You've sold him to a non-Jew. You haven't broken his arm. You haven't cut off his leg. You've sold him to a non-Jew. So there's certain halachas as a result of that. But where there isn't visible damage for which the aggrieved is grabbing the money he's entitled to, at least, or he believes he's entitled to, if there isn't visible damage, the principle of tfisa doesn't apply. You can't grab and then say, I've grabbed and I'm entitled to it. You can only do that when the money is there to compensate you for visible damage. But in this case, it's not compensation for visible damage. Says the Migdal Oz. The Migdal Oz is probably the first parish on the Rambam. Migdal Oz was the Talmud of the Rashbo. It was a chavrusa of the Ritvo. So one of the Rishonim from Spain writes on the Rambam, and he brings Eini ro'eh choser mamon gadol kazeh me'olam. I've never seen a greater damage to an individual than this damage which the owner caused the slave. And you can, it's very obvious, it's very visible. Firstly, he says the non-Jewish slave owner is not governed by the laws of the Torah or the morality of the Torah. And in those days, slave ownership was seen as a right, and you owned the slave and you could torture the slave and do what you wanted. So the slave was in for a terrible time, having been sold to a non-Jew. How can you say there's no damage? If he was sold to a Jew, he would have been treated according to the laws of the Torah. Now he's being sold to a Goy, he's going to be treated really badly. And you're taking the mitzvahs away from him, which is more than monetary damage. Interesting Migdal Oz, that the spiritual damage of removing this body of halachot from an individual is more harmful and more damaging than any physical monetary damage could possibly be. That's the reason for the knas. You see how serious it is. So the Migdal Oz says the knas is because you've damaged him. You've damaged him by removing him from the mitzvot. In the case of Mishnah, the Mechaber of the Shulchan Aruch brings the Migdal Oz, and he also says on the Ravid, Kosovo, Ravid, Ein b'knasot tfisa mo'elet b'mish chasaro mamon, ve'ein b'dvarav hechreya. It's not necessarily so. V'afilu lefi dvarav, and even if we do hold by what the Ravid says, even if we agree with the Ravid that there's no tfisa, you can't grab money if you haven't been wronged physically and visibly, even if we agree with that principle, ma shivkir me'amitzvot ein lecha chisaron gadol mizo ve'od she'yireh bo b'farech u'moch shetav bal Migdal Oz. As the Migdal Oz says, there's no greater damage than this. So we have a machlokes Rambam and Ravid here, and the Migdal Oz. The Migdal Oz usually goes to the defense of the Rambam against the Ravid. That's his style, and he can be quite aggressive in his defense of the Rambam. And here he claims, why does the Ravid say that there's no that because there's no physical damage, there's no tfisa? Says the Migdal Oz, there is physical damage. There's physical damage in how the owner is going to treat him, and the loss of mitzvot is worse than physical damage. Big chiddush of the Migdal Oz, and thereby he explains the Rambam. There's a beautiful piece by Rabbi David Pavarsky. Rabbi David Pavarsky is an underrated Godel Hador. He died not long ago. He was a Rosh Yeshiva in Ponevezh in Bnei Brak, but before that he was already a Godel in Eastern Europe. He learned with Rabbi Zalman Meltzer in Slotsk, and he learned in Mir, and he was a Talmud in Rabbi Chonon Wasserman's yeshiva. And he taught in Eastern Europe. By the time he came to Israel in the 1940s, he was already a Godel Ador, and he was teaching in a little cheder in Bnei Brak, a Chabad cheder, until the Ponevezh Ro found him and put him into as a Rosh Yeshiva of Ponevezh together with Rav Shach and Reb Shmuel Rozovsky. But I think the reason that he was underrated, and I heard shiurim, I knew Rabbi David Pavarsky, and I know his son, Rabbi Pavarsky, and I heard shiurim from all of them at that time. Imagine this group of people at Ponevezh Yeshiva, Rabbi David Pavarsky and Rav Shach and Rabbi Shmuel Rozovsky. And when Rav Shach and Rabbi Shmuel gave shiurim, they were masterpieces. You were in awe. They were works of such art. Especially Reb Shmuel had a brilliant delivery. Rav Shach, it was the intellectual brilliance. Shmuel Rozovsky was the intellectual brilliance and masterful delivery. You sat on the edge of your seat, you couldn't move until he'd finished the shiur. But Reb David Pavarsky was different. He would just learn through the Gemara and make comments, unbelievably insightful comments. in the style of Rabbi Chonon Wasserman, which was also the style of my cousin Rabbi Leib Gruvitz, Rosh Yeshiva of Gateshead. It was also a Talmud of Rabbi Chonon Wasserman. It had the same style. He would learn through the Gemara and make these short, incredibly insightful comments. And on this piece of Gemara, he has a beautiful piece. I've printed out almost the whole of it for people who want to go through it and have it available. But the way he resolves, he goes through with some questions and answers. In the end, he says the Machlokes Rambam and Raavad is about whether the Eved is a Baldin. Does he have a claim here? What is this Knas about? Is the Knas because the Eved has been wronged, in which case the Eved has a claim? Or is this a different kind of a Knas? And he says, according to the Raavad, this is a different kind of a Knas altogether. The Eved is not a Baldin. The Eved has no claim. This is not compensation to him. This is something completely different. According to the Rambam, the Eved has been damaged, as the case of Mishnah explains, and the Migdal Oz explain, the Eved has been damaged more severely than physical and visible damage. According to the Raavad, it's not physical and it's not visible, and the reason for the Knas is not to compensate the Eved. The Eved is not a Baldin. That's the Chidush of David Pavaski, that's the Machlokes Rambam and Raavad as explained by the Migdal Oz and the Kesef Mishnah. What I want to just touch on briefly is, so what is the Knas? So normally, who gets the Knas? Kefel is a Knas. You steal from somebody and you're found out and you've got to pay double. The double payment, the extra pay, you've got to pay the keren, which is compensation. I stole $100, I pay back $100, and then I have to pay an additional $100. That's knas. Who gets the knas? The aggrieved person gets the knas. It doesn't go into the state coffers, it goes to the aggrieved person. Dalad v'hei, in the case of an ox damaging. All the knossos in the Torah go to the aggrieved person. What about this knas here? The Eved doesn't get it. It's true that the owner has to buy the freedom of the slave, but there's no payment to the slave, and the slave can't claim it in Beis Din. He's not a Baldin. So who is the Baldin? What is the nature of this? It's a D'Rabbanan, it's a Knas D'Rabbanan, but what is the nature of the Knas? So I explained to you that when you take away a body of halachot from an individual or from a thing, you're reducing its level of Kedusha. And we had that even, it's interesting, those of you who learned Bechoros with me several years ago will remember in the case of selling an animal to a goy, and the concern that the Dinei Shabbos won't apply anymore to the animal. That a Jew is mitzvah b'shvitat behemto b'Shabbos. There are halachas that apply to your animal as well on Shabbos. If you sell the animal to a goy, those halachas are removed. So what's so wrong with that? And we learned at that time, you're reducing the level of kedusha attached to this particular shore. But it goes further than that. When you reduce the level of Kedusha from an individual or from a specific object, you're not only reducing Kedusha from that person and from that object, you're reducing the amount of Kedusha in the world. You're reducing the amount of Kedusha in the Jewish people. You're taking an Eved Kanani and there's some halachot attached to him. So there's a body of Kedusha, there's a level of Kedusha attached to him even as an Eved Kanani, and you sell him to a non-Jew, those halachot fall away, and you've removed some of the Kedusha attached to the Jewish people. You've diminished the level of Kedusha attached to the Jewish people. And there's a lot in Kabbalah, Rav Kook writes a lot about it also, in how when a person is developing his own level of Kedusha, whether it's through the keeping of the mitzvot, through struggling with his Yetzer Hara, with connecting his seichel, his intellect, to his koach hadimyon, to his emotional capacity and developing it properly, whatever it is that a person is doing to elevate his own level of Kedusha, it's not only his own level of Kedusha that he's elevating the Kedusha of the people around him. We need to understand our connectedness to the people around us. And depending on us, I've spoken often about some of the scientific work that's been done there in the emotional connections between us and the people we know, the people we bonded with, and sometimes even very directly. Our moods can affect the people around us, even if they don't have direct sight of us. And certainly our level of Kedusha. So when we are mindful of the halachot that govern us, when we are intentional about learning the halachot and understanding the halachot and observing the halachot, it's not just our own kedusha that becomes reinforced and strengthened. We radiate a level of kedusha to the people around us and to the world around us. And we need to know that as Jewish people, that's perhaps our key tafkid in the world, is to increase the kedusha in the world, l'taken olam b'malchut shaddai, to make the world a better place because of the kedusha we bring into the world. And we bring that kedusha into the world not through any kind of mystical activity, just through the observance of the body of halachot that attaches to us in all the various different situations in which we as Jews find ourselves.